In this class we want to talk about the decision-making process and problem identification. When a strategy has been selected, it needs to be implemented. But in selecting the strategy, the company will have looked at alternative strategies also, and it must make a decision between the competing strategies. So it must look at decision making, and it must look at the problem identification, any problems associated with strategies, and how to look at the problems and how perhaps to reconcile the problems. So we're going to have this short class on problem identification, and we're going to look at, to start, the decision-making process and decision criteria. How will the decision be made? In other words, what decision criteria will be used? Now, it's important to identify what the criteria will be. What is the key focus of management in making decisions? Is it to avoid risk, or to plunge in and take a risk and hope for much greater rewards? So what exactly are the criteria to be used? And reviewing the alternatives. Well, the decision must be made between alternatives, and these must be fairly judged. So looking at alternatives, there should not be bias in looking at the alternatives. They should be looked at honestly and considered on their merits. The management should not approach a set of alternatives to a problem with some predisposition. They should not approach it with their minds made up. They should look at the alternatives fairly and honestly to see if the right alternative, the most appropriate alternative, can be selected. Not a decision perhaps made in advance without recourse to the facts and figures and to the details of the problem. So we need to know what the decision criteria are. We need to know what's the management looking to achieve in assessing a problem. What sort of outcome is it looking for? How will the decision be judged? In other words, what's the decision criteria? And then openly looking at the alternatives to find the best one, and not carrying in a prejudged position, not carrying in a position which is fixed from the start, because that is not looking at the alternatives. That's simply selecting what the management wanted right from the start. Looking at alternatives means looking at all of them openly to select the best one. So there should be clear identification of the problem. A solution cannot be determined unless there is a clear problem to be solved. The problem must be clearly stated, and for that matter the solutions, or the possible solutions, should also be clearly understood. If not, then the business is incurring more risk in selecting a solution, or a perceived solution, when all of its implications are not fully understood. So clear identification of the problem is important, and the problem should be stated in a way which makes it easy to understand. And there should be clear statement of the decision criteria. Return to the decision criteria and select the optimum solution for the problem. Having critically assessed the problem using all of the criteria that the management want to bear on the problem, all of the standards it wants to bring to bear. Should the company be aiming at higher profits, higher growth? Should it be trying to achieve an alternative objective like supporting an existing product? What are the distribution implications of the product, and so on? So having looked at all of the decision criteria, go back and select the best one. but that should be done after a full review, not, as I said earlier, by carrying in a solution and going through the motions of looking for an alternative when in fact the management is already committed to one particular solution. That's not an ideal way of working. Critically analyze the alternative solutions. This generates confidence in the selection of the solution. So critically analyze. Be open and be fair about the implications of all of the possible solutions so that the best solution can be selected from amongst them. And select the best alternative. Based on the criteria make the decision and select the alternative judged best to solve the problem. So be fair and select the best alternative, having critically appraised all of the alternatives, not any prejudged one. Implement the alternative. The selected solution must be communicated to all and clearly explained. So it must be understood widely what the selected solution is and how it will be implemented. The logic of the decision must be widely understood so that there is commitment to its implementation. Why that particular route was selected when alternative routes were available, that should be clearly understood. They were selected because it was the best one, and why was it the best one? Well, explain it. The explanation will engender commitment to its implementation. The workforce will try harder to implement it because it was logical, it was the best decision. Finally, critically evaluate the decision's effectiveness. Emotional attachment to a decision can be damaging. An unbiased appraisal is required when assessing the effectiveness of the decision. This is what I've been saying right throughout this session. If the management has a predisposition, if the management is committed to a certain solution, if it's committed from the start to that solution, then this whole exercise has been a waste of time. Selection of the best solution involves listing the alternatives, listing all of their implications, and selecting logically from amongst them according to some decision criteria. This set of criteria will specify what is the best solution. So the best solution should be selected by that criteria, and it should be done logically. And that is the best solution. The point that this class is making may seem obvious and straightforward, but often overlooked. We do it in our personal lives. We have a problem and we get in our minds what the solution should be, and we don't really sometimes look at all of the alternatives. Perhaps that's a convenience, perhaps looking at the alternatives involves time and resources, maybe travel and cost. But generally speaking, what we should do, if at all possible, is list all of the alternatives and decide clearly what we want. And then looking at the alternatives and knowing what we want, make a logical decision. And in some respects, it's as simple as that. So that's problem identification. It's really an overview of this, and this particular class overlaps with other classes. Indeed, it overlaps with other classes in other modules. But for the moment, that's all we need to say about this, so thank you for watching.